My name is Ramon Mitchell, and I'm a sophomore theology major here at McCarthy University.
And I'm Mary Catherine Chambers, and I'm a political science and French major.
And we will be the moderators for tonight's event. Our topic for today is politics of the papacy. And I have the pleasure to welcome our very own Lino Rulli, who is a Johnny and an alum of the School of Theology. So that shows to all my theology friends that you can with some Emmys right here. So, Lino, to start off, would you mind telling us a bit about yourself?
Sure. Where do I begin?
I begin by turning the microphone on. After I learned how to turn a microphone on, I went into television. So I'm born and raised in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm Italian American, and that explains the nose, in case you were curious. For those in the back, it's not a prop. It's not glued on, it's actually mine. And so that hotbed of Italian American Catholicism known as St. Paul, Minnesota. I think there's 8 of us. And so I went to public high school, public grade school, junior high, Catholic high school. I went to a Catholic university named St. John's University. Some of you may have heard of it. I gotta say, I one in New York, I mean. Now this one here, I got to go to the school because my dad was not able to, when he was going to college, didn't have the grades. And so he forced my way into this university. I got a communications degree and didn't know what I'd be doing with that for a living, so I stayed on and got a master's degree in theology. And then those two things are nearly unemployable. So I moved down to the Bahamas and taught high school at the high school he went to, except I went there before he was born. And then I lived in Italy for a year so that I could hang out with people that look like me. And then I ended up working in television, and I worked in TV for 8 years, and then 8 years ago I moved to New York City, and I hosted a radio show for SiriusXM for the last 8 years there, and I worked for Cardinal Timothy Dolan, who's the Archbishop of New York, as his personal media advisor, and I hope to live to 75. That's my entire life. That's my biography.
All right, thank you, Lino. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in about Pope Francis. This is the politics of the papacy. So we were wondering why, in your opinion, has the Pope been so popular in these recent years?
Why is the Pope popular? First of all, there was very little to be expected when he was elected because we didn't know who he was. The night he was elected, I was in Rome, and I've been there like a week up until that point, both on my own radio show and I was doing work for CNN at the time on Piers Morgan Tonight. Anybody remember Piers Morgan? Yeah, he got fired. So, it's another claim to fame. I can put that on the old resume. And so I was doing that every night and then doing my radio show during the day. And Piers would ask insightful questions like, will it be Cardinal Dolan of New York or Cardinal O'Malley out of Boston? And I would say, like, we make it a New York-Boston thing, even though it's electing the Pope. The day Francis was elected, I was brave enough to say on the radio he had no chance to win. Because we looked at his bio and we said, well, this guy has no chance. In 2005, it was the conflict basically went down to Benedict and Francis, Ratzinger and Bergoglio. I don't know if you know, Benedict won. And so I said, well, just 8 years later, why would they elect him? And the church is looking for a younger man and somebody with a little bit more vigor and energy. And only in the Catholic Church do we go, we got a 76-year-old, how about him? So when he came out, we didn't know who he was. But one of the reasons I really think he's so popular is because of the very first 2 words he said, which were extremely simple. He simply said, buonasera. And for the people who speak Italian in the square, it was just so comfortable and so informal. It was not a prayer to start with, it was just good evening. Hey, how are you? Like I'm one of you guys, even though I'm from Argentina. And then he said they called out a guy from the ends of the world. And then he was, after he was done talking, they took the mic away. And he was like, I want the mic back. and he started thinking of all these things he wanted to say. And he goes, no, tomorrow I'm going to go to the Church of St. Mary Major because I want to pray in front of, popes never gave their itinerary up until then, of what they were doing day to day. And they took the mic away, and he's like, I got one more thing. And so he keeps talking, and he's got so much to say. And not the least of which, when he said, I would now like us to take a moment of silence. And he actually said, I would like you to bless me. Many people translated it to, I would like you to pray for me. But for him to bow his head and ask not just for prayers, but for blessings from the people, it was not a pope here and us down here. In a sense, he turned it around and was like, I need your help. And then I got to meet the pope, and I've seen the pope in countless countries and countless situations. And the number one thing he always says to every person he meets is pray for me. I think that humility and that simplicity and this very normal way of speaking and communicating is one of the many reasons he's super popular.
Awesome. You mentioned that we didn't know anything about him before he became pope. Do you think that perhaps helped him in his popularity, having a completely blank slate to start off with?
Absolutely. Benedict XVI, I was also in Rome the day he was elected. And when John Paul II had been the Pope for 27 and a half years, there weren't that many other guys who were on the ballot, if you will, because he lived so long. And many of you won't remember this, but in the 90s, I was working in television at the time, we were creating documentaries and news pieces for CBS based on his quote-unquote imminent death. The people we had on these interviews died before we would ever air these things. So people who had said, oh, who the next pope's going to be, each guy died. And so by the time, I don't mean to say by time, when John Paul II passed away, there weren't that many guys that you said, I know a great candidate. But people knew Cardinal Ratzinger because of his platform where he worked, which is called the Congregation for Doctrine of the Faith, which is a place that he was known as God's Rottweiler. He was known as, a lot of things that, fair or not, that's what he was known for. So Benedict XVI, and plus he's German. I know I'm in Minnesota where we got Germans here, right? Germans aren't always the warmest, excuse me. But, you don't go, oh, German, God's love. Those two things are always So Benedict had a lot going against him at the time. Francis, you're 100% right. He was a clean slate in the sense of almost nobody knew anything about him. At CNN, where I was working, but at MSNBC and Fox, it was the exact same thing. We had a bunch of pictures and names of all the potential popes. And when I say all the potential popes, I mean the ones we thought would win. And we knew their names in Latin. Bergoglio was nowhere on the list. So when he was elected, we all were like, good. We know 3 paragraphs about this guy. One of them being he has one lung. You don't know a lot about a person when a highlight is, he's only got one lung? We don't know anything about his history for the most part. And I think that's why he got to not just invent himself, but for anybody who's known about him for the first 76 of his life, he really reinvented himself. And so the world was like, okay, and it has embraced him like nothing I've ever seen.
So, you talked a little bit about simplicity, and Pope Francis is big on the lead for minimalism, charity, and simplicity. What do you see as the Cardinal's response to these traits?
I see the pint, and now I see the politics. Okay, we got right to it. Huh? What are the Cardinals' responses? Well, I'll say it in many different ways, politically and honestly. There are some cardinals who absolutely love Pope Francis, and there are some cardinals who do not. There are some cardinals that I get to go to Rome rather regularly, and there are some who honestly figure they can wait it out. And they don't love the tenor, and they don't love the freewheeling way he speaks. And because he just talks, and then other people have to articulate what he said. I have been one of the people who had to do that. MSNBC 2 weeks ago asked me to talk about the fact that Pope Francis the day before had just off the cuff told a story about a God's love for children and a parent's love and a father's love. And he was saying, sometimes dads, you want to punch your kid in the face. But when you don't do that and you just spank them, things like this is really a good way to show love. Now, so I didn't make that appearance because they were like, is the Pope for corporal punishment? And it's really difficult because, first of all, he was just telling a story. And in some cultures, that would really be, wow, I don't get to punch my kid in the face anymore. This Pope's a real hardliner. And in other cultures, you go, are we for spanking? I don't think we're for spanking. So that's my own personal experience. Many cardinals, though, feel a bit thrown off sometimes because they don't know how to react when the Pope says something, and then how is that lived out in their diocese or archdiocese? And especially when it comes to his real simplicity of life, as you pointed out. I work for a guy, the Cardinal Archbishop of New York lives on Madison Avenue. He lives a block away from Rockefeller Center in a mansion that he didn't buy, in a mansion that he doesn't own, and in a mansion that even if he wanted to, couldn't sell. But the New York Times still wrote a story about his mansion, and it's a gigantic mansion. I love hanging out there. But it's not his fault. So now he wrestles with it. So cardinals wrestle with, what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to move out of this? Am I supposed to, should the homeless move in? They don't exactly know. So from a very practical level, almost every cardinal that I've spoken with says he challenges us, and sometimes that makes us uncomfortable. And yet they usually love him for it. And then there are times, the vast majority love the Pope, obviously, since they voted for him. But I think there are some who might go, this is way more than we bargained for. I mean, the Pope right now is trying to completely upend the Vatican Bank and how the Vatican finances work and how the bishops are selected and everything else. Well, you can imagine if your job is in the Vatican and he's saying, you're a bureaucrat that's not needed. There are some cardinals who feel less strongly their affection for the Pope, as anybody does when the Vicar of Christ reminds you that you're not doing a good job. So there are cardinals who love him and there are cardinals who have reservations for sure.
So you talked a lot about the cardinals, and so
You asked about it. In my defense.
how do you see the next papal election going?
Oh, we're killing this guy off already? I like this guy. I don't know where I'm at. How do I see the next one going? I'll make a prediction here that'll sound strange, and I mean it. And I mean it just practically. I love Pope Francis to death. I hope he lives 100 years. I see a world where Pope Francis, and he's not even talked about this himself. He's talked about 2 or 3 years. And as he calls it, going to the Father's house. He's talked about this not being a long papacy. He's also talked about the possibility of retirement. I could see, and Benedict XVI, by the way, is in incredible health. And I think he did the right thing by stepping down because his health was not enough to lead the universal church. I could easily see Benedict living to 100, and either him and Francis moving in together for the greatest reality TV show in history. Or, in a somber way, I could see Pope Francis sadly passing away, and Benedict still being alive and having to do the funeral. And now, if you're asking who I think the next Pope is going to be, I again hope it's a long, long ways away, but I will say that I think as an Italian, our streak is broken. We went 500 plus years, and everybody looked like me. And then John Paul II, love him to death, my favorite Pope, but Polish. And, and so I think, we went, Pope, no offense, I enjoy pierogies. Don't want to offend anybody here. I see now, Polish, German, Argentinian. My prediction will be Asian, and my prediction would be a guy by the name of Cardinal Chito Tagle, who's the Cardinal Archbishop of Manila, who is known as the Asian Pope Francis. He's in his mid-50s. He's a tremendous personality. And, he's so young that at the last conclave 2 years ago, Cardinal Dolan asked him for proof of his confirmation certificate. Like, are you really even old enough? Have you been confirmed yet? Do you shave? This guy, everybody loves. And Pope Francis has made a real emphasis on where the church is growing and where she is not. And there's a reason why the Pope isn't spending a lot of time visiting Europe. And there's a reason why he has taken 2 trips to Asia. I got to go to both of them. I'm in South Korea and the Philippines. His focus is where the church is growing, Asia. And I would not be surprised that at this next papal election, because even 10 years from now, Cardinal Tagle will still be a man in his mid-60s and will only, I think, be more seen as the type of leader the church could use as it continues with Francis's path of renewal.
So you mentioned that this Archbishop from Manila, was it? Okay. Was like a little Pope Francis, like a...
I mean, he's Asian and short, yes. But I said Asian Pope Francis. It's a little. I mean, he's shorter than me, and I'm not exactly a giant, so you're right.
Just by that, do you mean that he has more of a progressive focus in the church, or did you be influenced by that?
So, I mean, I didn't name him the Asian Pope Francis. Like, I didn't mean to be like, yo, you're like Francis, but Asian. That's been sort of the story, because they're close, first of all. And I don't know if I would even use a label like progressive, whether it be for Francis or anybody, and I might use words more like pastoral. This guy is with his people. I'm speaking both about Francis, but I also mean about Cardinal Tagle. I know it sounds like I'm self-serving if I tell a story about me and him, or he and I. I didn't take English courses, so I don't know which of those it is. But the day I got to meet him, we hung out for a good portion of the afternoon, and he said, tonight, why don't you come out? I'm going to a parish visit that's really in, one of our poorest parts of Manila. I'm like, great. That's what I want to do. So I said, sure. And so he goes, okay, well, if you're going to come over tonight, here's my cell phone, so just text me when you arrive. That's not common protocol when it comes to cardinals of the church. In fact, we call them princes of the church, and Francis just a few weeks ago said, okay, quit calling them princes of the church, because that paints a picture of royalty, and we're not royalty, we're servants. It's that kind of mentality. So when I drove up to his place, I'm driving to the Archbishop's residence, and I just texted him, I'm like, hey, I'm outside. He goes, all right, I'll be right there. So he comes and gets me, and we're hanging out, and he's like, oh, so you gotta try these sweets. You gotta, like, he couldn't be more hospitable. He couldn't be more with his people. When we drove through the dangerous part of town, yes, he had a driver, but it's no entourage, there was no security. It was a guy driving the car, he was in the front seat, I'm sitting in the back. And we go to a place where people love him, where they don't just go, there's a cardinal archbishop of the Catholic Church, but there's a real affection for them. And he hung out all night after, not all night, but he hung out as long as they wanted to hang. He talked, he hung out, he laughed. He's with the people. And that's something I think Francis is really trying to encourage every bishop, especially a cardinal, to have, be like, is be with your people. The Pope is sort of famous for saying that these guys should smell like their sheep. That's what I mean about Cardinal Tagle, is he smells like his sheep. And so that's an attractive feature for those who would say, this is what we're looking for in a Pope. This type of thing needs to continue.
Awesome, thank you. You mentioned how Pope Francis has been encouraging his bishops to be smelling like the sheep. Has he been selecting a different kind of bishop than past popes like Pope Benedict XVI, or is it more just encouraging a different focus for them?
For the most part, and I don't know if I haven't studied every bishop in the world yet. That's what I'm doing in my free time when I go on vacation. But for the most part, the sense I get from my friends is there used to be a certain path in the church if you would like to become a bishop. And that path would be, for instance, if you're an American, perhaps you would study in Rome, or what's called the North American College. Some call it the West Point of Seminary. So if you get selected by your bishop, you might end up becoming a bishop yourself, or an archbishop, or a cardinal. And there's a long legacy. My boss, Cardinal Dolan in New York, when he was in seminary, the guy who lived across the hall from him was a guy by the name of, his last name was DiNardo, so it was Dolan and DiNardo. DiNardo is now the cardinal in Houston. In other words, this is a place, right? And maybe you become a rector of a seminary, or you work at a bishop's office. That's one way to become a bishop. And it seems, again, it's only 2 years, but it seems Francis is much less finding guys from an ideological point of view. Or you're a conservative or you're a liberal. But he's looking at it more of a pastoral point of view. Oh, you're in a parish. People might actually be surprised if I pick you as a bishop. That's the type of guys, again, not universally, but that it seems is the path. And in fact, a friend of mine who's a priest, who would kill me for telling this story, he would like to be a bishop one day. And so he's been on the right path up until this poll. And now he is requested to go to a Spanish-speaking parish in the inner city because he says he wants to be with the people. Maybe he does. However, he's a pretty good friend of mine. And we've called him out, we go, wait a second. A year ago, you loved being with rich people and being in this circle. Now you're going to this circle, huh? Is it because you want to be a bishop? No. I just feel like Francis is calling us to really be in the parish. So whether he's telling the truth or not, I don't know. But it puts him much more. You go, that's great. Now there's a guy who speaks Spanish, who's in the inner city, who knows what it's really like to be with people without a lot of resources, a lot of money. So that's the type of guy Francis would like to pick. And I love it. It's the greatest thing ever. If guys like my friend then start manipulating the system, but are serving the church by doing it, and then they're going into inner city parishes instead of just staying with the rich parishes in the suburbs. So in a sense, the church wins, and he still becomes a bishop. Maybe. It's not promised yet, but if I come back in 10 years, I'll tell you his name and I'll put the word bishop in front of it.
All right, so shifting from the bishops, Lino, what do you see as Pope Francis' effect on public opinion, whether he's coming up with a statement on climate change, policy, stuff like that?
I think it's great in the sense that, well, here's the thing. He's going to come to Washington, D.C. next year, and he's going to speak to that joint House of Senate. I'm not a politician, I'm sorry, folks. Politics and a pint, I really know my beer better. Joint session of Congress. Is that what he's doing? Okay. So he's going to speak to the joint session of Congress, whatever that means. And I believe it means John Boehner will be there, and you know he's going to go tan. And I think it's going to look tremendous off against the white. I think it's going to be a great visual. And so you're going to have all the Republicans and the Democrats there. And I think what the Pope will do is make everybody uncomfortable, but perhaps they will be so full of themselves that they will not understand when he is speaking against them. They will only hear when he is speaking for them. So in other words, when he says climate change, no different than a State of the Union address, I think the group's going to stand up, and it's like, yes, we've got the Pope on our side. And then if that same group is not as in favor of, say, some pro-life issues, and he says we must be pro-life from conception to natural death, and perhaps another group who isn't so sure about the climate change stands up, they go, yes, the Pope is for our public policy. I think they're all going to listen to what they want to listen to, which ultimately means his effect on public policy is very little, because they will say, well, I am so glad he talked about immigration. But the people who are against immigration didn't hear it somehow. And then when he'll say something about another issue, those folks who are against it won't hear that as well. So I think many people will use it in a political way to say the Pope is on our side. But if you challenge them and say, but the Pope is not on your side in this other realm, they would say, well, let's not forget we have a separation of church and state here. I mean, the Pope isn't our leader, correct? I think they're going to find themselves talking out of both ends of their mouths, and I don't think there would be a lot of journalists or others who will challenge them on that. And so I think the Pope will have an impact on public policy in the forms that the people who choose to use his words for their side will try to use them to their benefit.
And do you see that as being the same across the board for nations all over the world, or is that sort of an American thing, or is it a Western thing?
Yeah, I think it's a around the world thing. Now, I know you'll be surprised to imagine the guy who didn't know how to say joint house of whatever isn't as fluent in Filipino politics as I should be. However, when I was there, for instance, I found him doing the exact same thing. He was doing things that upset this part of the political party, and then he upset this part of the political party. But because he's just about the most famous, well-loved person on earth outside of, I don't know, Katy Perry or something. Because One Direction, I think, is even more loved. But because he is so incredibly loved, it's very dangerous to call him out on anything. And so the fact of the matter is, when he was in South Korea, there was a ferry that there was a group of students who was on a ferry, and the ferry had sunk. And I'm going to say the number, and I'm sure I'm wrong. Let's say 80 kids died, 80 students died, maybe 100 students died. And when he came a few months later, the people were still very much against the government. I mean, extraordinarily against the government, and there were people outside protesting and holding up signs and everything. And Francis, being Francis, at one point, when the Popemobile was going by, he saw these big signs, and he said, "Stop the car, I want to get out." And he got out and he talked to them. And they gave him a pin to put on that meant he was the Pope, was in solidarity with them and against the government. And the Pope had, I will use the word lackey because I can't think of a nicer word. So one of the people around him saying, Holy Father, you got to take this pin off. We don't want to upset anyone. And exactly him being him, he's like, no, I think I'm going to keep it right where it is, in fact. But again, if you get voted Pope, take it off, feel free. And so he says, I'm going to keep this on. And you know what the government officials did? Nothing, because he is so incredibly popular. They don't want to say anything against him, so they sit there, in a sense, almost embarrassed or with egg on their face, but acknowledging the fact that they're not embarrassed and saying, yes, but he's with us on whatever topic they want to say he's with us on, and ignoring the actual symbol that he is wearing that says he is not with them on that. So that's an example of, I've seen it around the world, but because of his popularity, and even for himself, he can say things and he gets away with it, and he's like the Teflon Pope. You put it up and it just bounces right off. And I like it.
Okay, we're going to open it up to the audience to ask questions. Beth will be running around with a wireless mic, so just give her a wave if you want to ask a question.
Hello?
Okay. Hello. Oh, I thought that was your greeting. I just wanted to greet you back. Hello.
All right, so I guess my question is, what's the main quality or personality trait that you think makes Pope Francis so personal?
The main personality trait, right?
Yeah.
I think there's, may I have several, or can I only name one? As many as I want. All right. I think is the first quality that makes him so incredibly attractive and personable is the fact that he has Italian roots. Perhaps I'm biased. What it really is, I really genuinely believe this, is he knows where he's from. And a story that a friend of mine told, which I absolutely love, and yes, it could be his humility or his simplicity and all these things, but the story will wrap up everything that you need to know, I think, about this Pope, is that when he was the Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires, Argentina, when you're the Cardinal, you get invited to a lot of dinners, a lot of political events. The ambassador would like you to come to this event, and the president would like you to come to this event, and you can hang in a lot of very wealthy, influential circles. And he never did. Nobody knew this guy because his time was always spent in the parishes, but specifically in the slums. And he spent time with people who were not perhaps the most well-educated in the form of their education at a university or high school or something like this, but they would be people who would be what you could call street smart. So he understood in order for his message to get across, he had to tell stories in his homilies. And he had to tell stories that people would get and that he could relate, that they could relate to. And he also wanted to always do it in a sense that he would leave you with 2 or 3 points. I mean, we've all been to Mass, maybe we've never been to Mass, but some of us have been to Mass, and you can leave Mass and go, I don't remember one single thing about that homily other than that I fell asleep, or that I zoned out, or whatever. The Pope is very smart in the fact that he always says, there are a couple things I want people to remember about me. And one of the reasons he's revolutionary, and some have said he's the perfect Pope for Twitter because he can keep things to 140 characters. I mean, he said himself, he's a dinosaur. He doesn't understand what a twit is. And so he wouldn't understand how to use any of this technology. His personality and his character comes from the people that he spent the majority of his ministry with. And those are the people in the slums. Those are not the wealthy and the educated. He is an outsider. And so for an outsider to be voted in Pope is really incredible and crazy. But his character is that of the people, which is why if the people who are in the slums and the people who do not have the degrees in theology understand every word he says without ever reading a book or an encyclical of his, because he's one of them. That's the character that I find in him, is he's the average guy. But don't let that fool you. He still has a doctorate in theology. He got it in Germany, but nobody ever brings that up. It's just that he's that smart because he's from them.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank you for coming out. This has been great. It's been really entertaining. But I know you mentioned that public officials have a tremendous talent of cherry picking the Pope's comments. But do you think his pastoral approach has almost increased the influence of the papacy, maybe beyond what Pope Benedict had, at least on governments around the world?
I think the fact that the Pope has been invited to the joint House of Senate, that's called the joint session of Congress, I think that alone says it, because no Pope's ever been invited to that kind of a thing. So you're 100% right. Now the big question though is, will it have an impact? Will it have an effect? Will the countries of the world listen to him or only cherry pick? I think everybody wants him at the table because they get a picture and they have the photo op and everything else. I am not convinced, for the most part, I am not convinced that he can really change a lot of minds when it comes to governments. However, I think there are examples like Syria, where the Pope stood up, metaphorically speaking, and said, no, we're not going to do this, and we're going to pray. And there was a change in policy in that particular case. I don't think that's something we can look to regularly, but I think that's an example of he gets invited to speak with government officials and in front of them. And while I don't think it changes much with public policy, I think that we occasionally will see him being invited and the church's message is heard. And that to me is what's most impressive. People can take it or leave it. I mean, that's up to them. But the fact that you get a fair shot with Pope Francis, they're going to listen to what he has to say, and if they ultimately say, and what he says is crazy, fine. But I think the papacy has been heightened to a level because, not just because of his popularity, but because of the media, and because of social media. We know what he says every single day. He hasn't said anything this week. He hasn't made news this week, only because he's on retreat. And as soon as he stops being on retreat, he'll say something and people will talk about it again. And so he has heightened the papacy to a level the world has never seen, but also the media has certainly helped him do that.
Good evening. Let's see. Now you spoke earlier about how he's made cardinals uncomfortable. Now, how would you say Cardinal Burke stands in regards to that?
Good. So Cardinal Raymond Burke, a guy from the Midwest, who he was the Archbishop of St. Louis, and then he went to Rome, and he was a very influential guy when it comes to the canon law, and the penitentiary is this big word they use there. So he was in charge of a lot of things that he was seen as a conservative. Conservatives thought he was very conservative. And a couple months ago, I'm just telling the story for those who don't know, right? So a couple of months ago, he was in a sense demoted from that post to a different post. He's now in charge of the Knights of Malta, so the Order of the Knights of Malta. It was seen as a demotion by a lot of people because this past October there was a synod. And in the synod there was a body of bishops and they gathered to talk about the family. And there were some in the body of bishops who thought conversations regarding Catholics who are divorced and remarried without getting an annulment should receive communion. And there were conversations about how should parishes be welcoming gay and lesbian Catholics into the church community and make them feel loved and welcomed. And Cardinal Burke was one who did not feel strongly that those conversations should be moving the direction they did, or more importantly, he felt very strongly that Pope Francis should say, that's fine to have all the discussions you want, we're not changing this. And so some in the media, and I work in the media, so I can be just as guilty of this as anybody, put Pope Francis and Cardinal Burke against each other because Cardinal Burke, to his absolute credit, was one of the only guys who would actually say what many cardinals were saying publicly. Now I find that part fascinating, that there would be guys together going, I can't stand this, I can't believe we're having this conversation. Your Eminence, how was the meeting? It was wonderful, really. It was a great, very, very fraternal conversations, and I think we're all on the same page. Cardinal Burke was like, no, I think the Pope needs to come out and say this. And I'm saying this as a brother, but he needs to explain to people that he's causing confusion by allowing the conversations to happen. So after the synod was done, that's when the demotion, if you will, occurred. So it depends then what version of the story you want to hear, because there's a story out there that that's what happened, there was retribution, and then there's another story that says the cardinal and the pope discussed well before the bishops, the synod of bishops, that there would be some changes and that he'd be moving to a different post. And this was well before any of this happened. So what I really think about Cardinal Burke is this. He's doing exactly what Pope Francis has asked for. Pope Francis has said, I want an open conversation. I don't want anybody to be embarrassed. I don't want anybody to be shy about what they really think. And so I want the bishops to come together, and he's like, I'm the Pope, I'll make the final decision, but I want you to tell me what you really think about divorce and remarriage, and I want you to tell me what you think about gay and lesbians in the church, and I want us to have a conversation. Don't worry about what the Pope says. So I think Cardinal Burke is doing exactly what Pope Francis has asked the bishops to do, and in fact, those bishops and cardinals who are feeling uncomfortable but not standing up the way Cardinal Burke does, I think are not nearly as, they're not men of integrity the way Cardinal Burke is by at least standing up and saying something. But I really don't think Pope Francis and Cardinal Burke are as far apart or as opposed to each other as we in the media like to make that out for, because it makes for a much better story.
Okay, hello? Thank you for being here again. Just kind of follow up with that question and the discussion we've had. Pope Francis has obviously gotten a lot of attention in the media. We've kind of talked about the effect it has had on the cardinals and those in the church. I would like to really talk about, ask your opinion on the effect it's had on the general public, where they see the church going, especially in relation to these, especially in relation to public perception of the Catholic Church, especially in regards to these issues that are seen as controversial.
I like the question because it lets me tell stories about myself, but I like the question because Pope Francis, for me, as a guy who works in the media, has been the greatest thing, because I can't imagine, nobody could have imagined 3 years ago the affection people in and out of the church have about the Catholic Church right now. So I live in New York City, and I went to a Metallica show one night. And Metallica, so I work for a company called SiriusXM Satellite Radio. They were playing in a small venue, it's the Apollo Theater. So there wasn't more than about 1,000 people there. And I was at the Apollo listening to Metallica, and they had an open bar. Just saying. And so they had an open bar, and when I went up to get my first complimentary beer, a guy came up to me who works for the Howard Stern Show. And a lot of my friends work for the Howard Stern Show. This guy's name is High Pitched Mike, because Mike has a high-pitched voice. And Mike came out of the closet, Mike's gay, on the Stern Show a few years ago. And Mike and I have known each other for many years, and Mike and I would sometimes have lunch together or whatever, and he would always say, this church of yours, I mean, how backward you are and how, just disrespectful you are. I'm like, okay. Are you finishing your fries or can I have some? So, yeah, he's my friend. He comes up to me and he said, you know what, I understand you're not changing the church teaching, but I love your Pope so much because I feel loved by him. And don't get me wrong, I'm never going to become Catholic, but I feel loved by him. I have had that story told so many countless times on national television, places where I wouldn't expect as warm an invitation, and the same topics 3 years ago would have been controversial and perhaps even confrontational. Because of Pope Francis, it feels like the tenor has completely changed, even if the anchors or reporters will say, Lino, we understand the church teaching is not changing on this. However, what are your thoughts on this? I think the public policy, I think the public perception has changed so much. Elton John, when he said that the Pope is a miracle of humility in a sea of vanity, I went and bought his album. And I'm like, you know what? I hadn't thought of Elton John in a few years, and I first downloaded, I mean, thank God for iTunes, right? I first just downloaded Tiny Dancer, and then I downloaded your song, and next thing I go, you know, I love Elton John. I forgot how much I love this guy's music. But when he said something, I go, this is really revolutionary because nothing has changed, but the tenor has changed, and people feel differently about the church. And I don't know about the church for the future, but I know that my job is made a lot easier by being the Catholic guy. And I know a lot of places that I go, the conversation has changed if the doctrine has not. And I find that absolutely a relief for me. And I find it fascinating that 3 years ago when Benedict XVI would make an international trip, my multi-billion-dollar company was not interested in investing $3,000 for me to go anywhere. And now, well, you got to go to the Philippines. If the Pope is going, you've got to go because we need to spend money on getting the gospel message out there. That is a change in mentality that I've experienced for myself professionally and personally that I absolutely love.
Hey, Lino. First of all, one more time, it is joint session of Congress. It has nothing to do with the fact that DC just legalized marijuana. But anyway, and because I am somewhat uninformed and would like to hear your thing, I'd first give the nickel tour of the Vatican financial issues and where you think it might be going.
Was that a pun?
Yeah, and I'm known for
Okay, the Vatican finances. So there's a thing called the Vatican Bank. That's not actually the title of it, but that's what the majority of people call it, is the Vatican Bank. And I mentioned right at the top of this, I'm Italian. So it's been run by Italians for centuries. I mean, it is dysfunctional, and there is bribery, and there is money laundering, and there are tons of things that this is how crazy the church that I love and the Vatican that I love has been allowed to do over the centuries until today. And this year's really the first year things are changing. So we're at the university here, and I don't know exactly how the departments are run, but I assume every department has a budget. Yeah, more or less. And you then have to, not go over the amount of money, and you have to report how much money your department made or spent in the course of the year. They've never done that at the Vatican. This year's the first year they're going to give this a shot. So when it comes to social communications, or when it comes to the office of bishops, yes, there was money coming in and out, but there was never an actual accounting of it that would say to you, here's where we are, so here's how we know how to spend next year and 10 years and 20 years, and here's where the investments are going. For the most part, it was done by people who were proficient in theology, but not necessarily the economy. Now a guy by the name of Cardinal Pell has showed up, that's his last name, and he's from Australia. And he's a big, tall, 70-some-year-old guy. I point out the age because what I'm saying is he's not going up the ranks anymore. He's ready to bulldoze the place. So he comes in as a Westerner saying, these practices are crazy. We're going to bring people in who do accounting or who do real numbers, and we're going to find out how much money we have, how much money we're spending, and we're going to hold each office accountable. This is not revolutionary when it comes to most businesses, but it has been when it comes to the Vatican. This is the type of change the Cardinals wanted when 2 years ago they were going into the conclave and they were saying, we need to reform the Curia. We need to reform the cronyism or any other word you want to use that is happening inside of the Vatican. And the Vatican Bank was one of the largest issues that they wanted to address. And now there's a lot of pushback on it because the guys who are working there, who are hiring their friends for different projects and making sure their friends get paid a lot or maybe a little money kicked back to the Cardinal on the side, all of these days might be over. And there's one number I'm going to totally get wrong, the same way I got joint session of Congress wrong. But when they did all the numbers, it turned out they had something like $1 billion that they didn't know in the reserves existed. So there's good news. That wasn't stolen. And so this is one of the things they're doing. And it's one of the reasons Pope Francis was elected as a man for renewal, but more importantly for change. He would upend the Curia. And he's doing so the best that he can. And he's not getting everybody fighting back, but there's going to be some pushback because if you've had this job for 10, 15 years, you don't want somebody coming in and telling you you've done a bad job and we're going to change your job. So the Vatican Bank, it appears to be in good hands.
Hello. When Pope Francis was first, or won the award to be on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine or whatever it was, he kind of joked he didn't know if it was an honor because Katy Perry was in second place, so what kind of award is it? So kind of going with that theme, what are the risks associated with him being so embraced with popular culture? And how does that relate to the quality of his theology or something like that?
So now, just to be clear, he didn't say that.
Oh.
The Vatican spokesperson, Father Lombardi, said Pope Francis is almost naively innocent when it comes to these things. Now, we're Americans, so we're like, wow, you made the cover of the Rolling Stone. Believe it or not, the 76-year-old Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires, that was not one of his goals in life. It's true, when he was elected to the papacy, he was in Rome and he called back home to Buenos Aires to his newspaper guy and he canceled his subscription, saying, I'm not coming back. There's no story of him canceling his Rolling Stone. So a lot of the stuff that we find wild, cover of Time magazine, cover of Rolling Stone, these sorts of things, he's getting these awards or adulation and accolades all over the world. Is there a danger to it? Only in the sense that we live in a soundbite culture, and so by definition, you're never getting the full picture of any human being, let alone a human being's theology. So it's very easy to simply take one thing and embrace it for it. Now, for me, as a guy who was born and raised Catholic and worked in Catholic media since 1997, if every once in a while the Pope gets misquoted in the positive and in the affirmative, I'm okay with that. We've only been misquoted for decades in the negative, or it's always been painted in the most negative light possible. So quite frankly, when Benedict XVI says no women priests, he's a misogynist. When John Paul II says no women priests, he's a misogynist. When Pope Francis, as he has said, says no women priests, they focus on something else. I'm okay with that. Like, I'm really comfortable with the fact that they go, fine, then we'll focus on something positive, you say. And I go, really? Okay, good. So you put him on the cover of Rolling Stone for something he has said that you appreciate. And maybe somebody will learn more about it, or maybe they won't. But one of the biggest issues, I think, with the church for a very long time is we can't get our message out. If we can't articulate our message, how on earth would somebody want to be embracing this message? So at least if you're like, well, you know, Hitler said some nice things, people go, what are you talking about? No. The Pope said some nice things. Unfortunately for Benedict and at times John Paul II, people were so turned off they wouldn't listen. So while there are dangers that the world or society might not fully grasp what he is saying, the advantage outweighs anything that I could see as a con, because the pro is somebody saying, let me read more about who am I to judge, and let me read more about the things he says about the poor. And let me read more about why he kissed the feet of a Muslim girl who was in a juvenile detention center on Holy Thursday, when the rubrics, that is, the rules on Holy Thursday say those should be men. And it goes without saying those should be Catholic men. It's important that if somebody goes, he's breaking all the rules, he kissed a Muslim woman's feet. If they leave it at that, fine. But if they look into it more and then go, oh, this is interesting. Now, why would he do that? And is this a show of love? Is this a show of defiance? What is it about this? Now somebody's learning about Catholicism, choosing for themselves if this is a faith they would like to be a part of or not. So I am such a huge believer, again, disclaimer, I have made my living in the media for the past 17, 18 years, so it's not like I'm a hater on the media. I think everything outweighs the positivity that somebody might just take a look at this message.
All right, thank you. Oh, go ahead.
Hey, Lino. Hey. It's good to see you. I think it's been well documented that President Obama was elected and re-elected largely because young people got on board and they were using social media to get the message out. Cardinal Dolan hired you in part to help him shape his message or communicate better to the media. How is the Catholic Church, whether it's Pope Francis or other cardinals, how are they using social media? You just said a second ago they're not getting the message out. How are they figuring this out, and how to use social media to connect with people?
So, I mean, the big thing is, I remember, 5, 6 years ago, when a friend of mine was like, you've got to get on Facebook. And I said, why? I've got my MySpace account. It functions wonderfully, and this is the future. Tom is my friend. If you remember, Tom was the founder of MySpace. So anyways, when you joined MySpace, your first friend was Tom, whether you wanted him to be your friend or not. And I didn't even understand. Now, I say that as a guy who was, in his late 30s. So then when I'm on the Facebook and I'm on the Twitter, and I know that's not what you actually call it, by the way. When somebody goes, oh, you got to get on Foursquare. I'm like, I'm going to wait for 5. When somebody says, get on Instagram, I'm like, it's enough. It's enough. When it comes to our church leaders, and I say this really in their defense, Cardinal Dolan, my boss, to this day doesn't know what this is. He doesn't understand it. Pope Francis he did a Google Hangout. I don't know if you saw this or not. Now, I'm already too old and I don't know what on earth a Google Hangout is, so I've never been. It sounds creepy. But, you want to hang out on Google? I don't know. No. So Pope Francis, for some reason, he did a Google Hangout. It was tremendous, but one of the kids asked him, oh, do you enjoy downloading pictures on your computer? And asked him a few other things. He goes, I'll be honest, I'm a dinosaur. I don't have any idea how any of this works. So Pope Francis has got millions of followers. Nothing, the fact of the matter is we as a church have so much to do though in this work because yes, the Pope has millions. Ryan Seacrest has more. So that means we're failing. Anytime you lose to Ryan Seacrest in anything, you're failing. And so we've got to do a better job, but we're at least doing a good job in the sense of the Pope doesn't know how to work it, and Benedict never gets credit for this. I've been on many national TV appearances where they're like, this Francis is so hip, he's even on Twitter. Benedict was the one who actually went on Twitter, it's just nobody knows. At Pontifex was his deal. He's the one that sent out the first tweet, and he called it at Pontifex, so it wasn't about at Benedictus, but it was at the Pope. So Francis slid in and was like, all right, guys, keep doing whatever you're doing. But the world's attention is paid. So now we have lay people working on behalf of the church leaders so they can do the churchy stuff and we can do the other stuff. So my boss, Cardinal Dolan, he still doesn't know what a Twitter is. And when people come up and they're like, I follow you on Twitter, he's like, yes. I hope we're all enjoying that. Do we eat or drink? What do we do on that? He doesn't know what's going on. And he's the most followed prelate in the world outside of Pope Francis. So it's partially a generational thing, but it's partially, you know what? The Cardinal at least let me tell him, get on Twitter. And now we have lay people tweeting things out for him every day. That's where I think the church moves forward in getting her message out. It's our church leaders and officials doing the cardinal stuff and the Pope stuff. And we all know Pope ain't easy, am I right, kids? I still think that joke's funny. But the Pope part ain't easy, but the stuff that we can excel at, finances, media, and you know what, when it's time to build a church, they don't usually say, let's get the monks involved, no offense, but it's not the guys who are building it, it's let's do it as a church community. And I think this is the way the church moves forward to get her message out, is by incorporating our leaders, Pope, Cardinal, Bishop, Priest, and the lay people who have a certain talent in whatever it might be, to come together, not just in social media, but in all media and pretty much any way we can get the message out there more.
Well, that about wraps it up for tonight, everybody. We want to give a huge thank you to our interviewers and to Mr. Rulli, of course, for being here tonight.